Good afternoon, everybody. I make that 2 minutes past, so welcome. And thank you very much for joining the first in what we hope is a series of educational webinars from Cyro. By way of an introduction, my name's Sam Sorrell, and I'm the CRO here at Cyro. And today we're going to be focusing on the subject of navigating PCI version 4, the critical changes to that standard, and how to stay ahead. Before we dive in, for those who are new to Cyro, just by way of a brief introduction, Cyro are a specialist cybersecurity practice focused predominantly on the delivery of professional and managed services. What we think is really important, however, is that we aim to act as a trusted partner to our clients, helping them to identify key risks against the organization, support them in the treatment and remediation of those risks to help protect their organization and their critical function, and then detect and respond to those threats in real time so that that key function isn't disrupted and the reputation of our clients is maintained. And that's why we work with a lot of the organizations we do. Over the next 30 minutes, however, we're going to focus on the subject of PCI and specifically the changes to version 4, thinking about how might these impact your businesses, but equally wanting to provide some hints and tips about how you can maintain and, where possible, simplify your compliance to that standard. To demystify all and the complexities of that standard, we're really lucky to be joined today by Peter Lane, who is our resident PCI expert and a really senior GRC consultant here at Cyro. Before we give him the floor and introduce him further, just some quick housekeeping points for today's perspective. We want to keep this a really open forum and make it a really worthwhile discussion. So Peter and I are happy to answer any of your questions whatsoever. Please do use the Q&A button across the top bar to post any questions that you've got, and we'll endeavour to dedicate a good time in today's session to answering those. If we run out of time for any reason on questions, or you feel you want to raise any privately with us, you can absolutely do so. We'll share our email addresses at the end of this session, and we'll share all details to get in contact directly after this, so that there isn't any issues there. And then finally, we are recording today's webinar. Don't worry, nobody's mics and cameras are on, so nobody will see you, but that will be so that we can share that afterwards. We'll send that round to everybody if you wish to revisit any of the subjects that we've talked about today. So let's dive in. Peter, first and foremost, give us a bit of background about yourself firstly, and why you're qualified to sort of talk on the subject today. But equally, let's start with looking at why we're discussing PCI today. I mean, the standard's been around a long time now, but it seems to be a bit of a hot topic. So why the focus?
Thanks, Sam. And again, I'd just like to say for myself, thank you everyone for joining. Good afternoon. It's a real pleasure to be here talking about one of my favourite topics, as sad as that might be. But also it's really kind of everyone to take the time out of their day and listen to me talk. My own wife and children don't seem to listen to me, so the idea that people have taken a break from work to come and listen to what I think is a really important topic is fantastic to see. So I am an information security consultant for Cyro Cyber, as Sam mentioned. I've got a background in supporting security efforts across a lot of different industries, and this ranges all the way from the military and government, all the way over to food retailers, parking providers, insurance providers, lots of different companies and organizations. Whilst I complete the more traditional and widely publicized standards and frameworks such as ISO 27001 and NIST assessments, I've also worked a great deal with PCI DSS QSA, which is a lot of letters, and I think probably as many letters as you can put into one acronym, without really being told off. What does it stand for? PCI DSS is the payment card industry data security standard, and the QSA area at the end is a qualified security assessor. And these are the people that have gone through the requisite training and been endorsed by the PCI Council to say, yes, you can go and do assessments to look at how people are complying to or not complying to the PCI DSS, the data security standard. The standard itself, or as I like to think of it, is a loose set of rules, was created by the council. And when I say council, that is the PCI SSC, the Security Standards Council. And this council is a group comprising of 6 very large payment brands. You'll almost certainly have heard of 1 or 2, if not all of them. These are the likes of Visa, MasterCard, JCB, Discovery, American Express, and over the past few years, they've been joined by UnionPay. The standard was created in 2004 to address interoperability issues between some of the different security standards that were enforced by each of the different payment brands. They identified that actually, we've got 6 or potentially more payment brands there with their own different rules, and they're being endorsed to different standards and strengths. Actually, we need to combine this to present a unified approach to how globally entities are processing and interacting with payments. Since that time, the standard's gone from strength to strength. Periodically, it's been updated to remain current with operating practices, and the more current threat landscape is a better way to describe it, really. The most recent update actually, and the reason we're talking about it today, took place over the past few years. It was widely communicated and gradually introduced, and so there's been lots of bulletins, lots of information put out, which is fantastic to see because they've introduced it slightly into the environment piece by piece, and we're now in a really interesting time. The latest version, which we refer to as version 4.0, soon to be superseded by 4.0.1 coming in the next 6 to 9 months. This went live in 2022, but the previous version remained in place until the 31st of March 2024. As my maths is just about good enough to be able to tell me, we're now past that date. And since the 1st of April 2024, this year, entities are no longer able to use the previous version 3.2.1. And so everything since the 1st of April has had to adhere to version 4.0.
Brilliant. I mean, it's one of those subjects that it's so hard to get into, isn't it? The nuances across all of those dates and versions. And I think that's probably what really we're going to focus on now. As you say, the PCI standard's been around for nearly over 10 years. So there's going to be a critical reason for those updates. So sounds like this new version's a bit of a step change. What has changed specifically in version 4, Peter?
Absolutely, and a step change is a great way to describe it. To say the least, and to put it simply, a lot has changed. The PCI councils understood that security practices must evolve, and as such, the threats have changed. And this is reflected in lots of the different variety of ways and lots of different changes throughout the standard. To name just a few, we have an expanded multi-factor authentication requirements. We have an updated password requirements, and these might seem quite self-explanatory, but then there's even more that's been introduced, such as new e-commerce and phishing requirements to address some of the ongoing threats. And then on the softer side, arguably, there's been some added guidance to help people better understand how to implement and maintain security. And this is something I think has been really welcome throughout the industry. Most of the people I speak to, as you alluded to earlier, comment commonly on how complicated the standard is itself and how strict it can be in certain respects. And the council have really understood this and said, okay, what can we do to help entities, but then maintain that minimum or the baseline standard of security that is so important when dealing with payment card security. Generically, version 4 has allowed increased flexibility. And I think this is the key term that they tried to stress when they were introducing it and issuing communications. There's more options now to achieve a requirements objective. There's not just the defined approach, which I like to term as the black and white, what it says on the paper. There's now options for certain requirements to invent your own customized approach. And this could be a new method to implement and validate a PCI DSS requirement. And it provides another option for organizations to use innovative methods to achieve security objectives. However, I should caveat that with there is a lot of the background work you need to do in order to implement this. So if you decide, actually, I don't want to meet the defined requirement on the way or in the way that the PCI Council say so, I have a new tool or method, or I want to change the frequency of my control checks. That's fantastic. Please, they would encourage you to do so. But you really do have to document a lot of the evidence and the design phase in order to make sure that the QSA, when they come to assess your environment, can understand how and why you've done that, and therefore design their own testing methods to ensure that it's being done adequately. So for that case, they actually said this is designed for risk mature organizations. This isn't the average person who's organizing their own environment and doing it on a weekend. That really have risk and security teams who can look after this continuously. Moving on, there's also the introduction of targeted risk analysis. This again is one of my favourite introductions. The council have decided actually we need to do more on the risk side, and we need to make sure that an entity is looking after that and monitoring it throughout the year continuously, as opposed to just the week before they have their assessment conducted. The targeted risk analysis, of which there are templates within the document itself, within the standard, it empowers organisations to establish a frequency for performing certain activities. And actually within the standard, there's bespoke requirements to say, if you do targeted risk analysis or these types of activities, you need to understand and document why you have done it to that degree, which is really fantastic. More granularly, looking more specifically at the report on compliance, which is one of the ways in which you can assess or be assessed. PCI DSS version 4 has introduced 63 new requirements. 13 of these apply immediately when using the 4.0 templates for assessments, while the remaining 51 are future dated. And I think this is something we might cover a bit more in detail in later sections of this meeting. These requirements will become mandatory after the 31st of March 2025. The future data requirements are included as a best practice for now, but they must be fully implemented by that date, the 31st of March 2025. An example of this that I think we can expect to see a lot of over the next 6 to 9 months is specifically for merchants and service providers that use websites or an e-commerce environment to collect payments for goods or services. When I've worked as a QSA, it's one of the most common payment channels that I come across because of modern technology and people's operating practices. It's just so common for people to say, I need to accept payment for goods and services. What's the easiest and safest way to do so? Okay, I need an iframe or a hosted payment page to a payment service provider, and that way I only have a very reduced burden and reduced risk to consider. Absolutely, and when I have worked as a QSA, I would say it's a great way to go. However, with the introduction of these new requirements, one of the new requirements, which is a future dated and set to be in place by next year, is for the relevant payment channels found within requirement 6.4, specifically focusing on public-facing web applications, and to make sure that they're protected against attacks. So within this requirement, it asks for a merchant's website to include, or if they're including a payment processor's embedded payment page, such as an iframe, it says that those payment page scripts have to be loaded and executed in the consumer browser and managed with a method implemented to confirm that each script is authorized, a method implemented to ensure the integrity of the script, and also an inventory in the background that you should maintain yourself to make sure that all scripts are maintained and written justification is recorded to say why. In the plain English, as that for me is not such plain English, it means that even if you have a website and you think I've reduced my scope just by hanging an iframe to a payment provider, fantastic, my job is done. It's not necessarily the case. Now you need to ensure that that page that you're providing for your customers has something on there to monitor in case a malicious actor of any kind decides to affect or impact your script that would normally send the customer to the payment service provider. And that's a really important update that I think we're going to come across in the next 6 to 9 months. And slightly on a separate topic, sorry to elongate my answer even further, I think it's important that we discuss self-assessment questionnaires. So again, I'll cover this in more detail later on, but self-assessment questionnaires are for any entity or organization that doesn't need to have an assessment conducted to such a greater degree as a report on compliance, the ROC as it's termed. The self-assessment questionnaire are validated tools designed to help merchants and service providers assess their compliance with PCI DSS. The questionnaires allow organizations to self-assess their security practices based on their specific circumstances, which I think is such a key step. In short, it's grouped the questions or requirements that the council believe are relevant to specific circumstances and allowed a format for people to comply without having to go through all of the intense 490-page document. And it's important for people such as my example earlier, where you had someone that just provides an e-commerce environment and they're hanging an iframe, for them to have to apply and go through a 490-page document is quite a big ask, when actually only a subset of those requirements would be relevant. Therefore, the council introduced self-assessment questionnaire A or AEP, depending on your circumstances. The SAQs have been updated in line with PCI DSS version 4 requirements. So the requirement wording on the SAQs now mirrors what is on the actual 4 standard, and the SAQ reporting responses are aligned with PCI DSS version 4. Also, each SAQ contains new guidance to support organizations completing the self-assessment process. And I always stress this is the key term, self-assessment. You can do this yourself, no matter the size of the entity, As long as you're processing the requisite number of transactions annually, and it doesn't go above a certain level, which we'll discuss further, you can do this process yourself. However, as we've already alluded to, it's a very complicated process. PCI DSS, it's a little bit of a beast. It's got some certain nuances, and if and where possible, it's always useful to include the services of a QSA just to ensure that you're meeting those requirements as you are attesting. The SAQ, in my opinion, that's received the greatest degree of change is the SAQ-D for service providers. It's got significant changes in. It now requires individuals performing the assessment to explain why their observations have led to the conclusions that they state, just the same as they would do on the report on compliance. The changes will contribute to a significant increase in time, and I think that's really important to be aware of. There's going to be an increase in time to perform the assessments and complete the report. As I mentioned, there are new requirements, but not only that, the sheer length of the document has been extended in order for the QSA or the person self-assessing to provide the relevant amount of information as to how and why they felt their requirement was met. And as mentioned, there's 11 new requirements which are only applicable to service providers, such as 12.5.2.1, which requires that your scope is documented and confirmed. If you're a service provider, it has to be confirmed by an entity at least once every 6 months, and if your environment receives any significant change. All SAQs include additional requirements for PCI DSS version 4 to ensure the SAQ continues to address that evolving threat landscape. And some entities will be glad to hear that specific SAQs now have even less questions. And that's the key. I think if you're one of those lucky few, really high five yourselves in the background, because what was already a difficult process might be slightly easier. Unfortunately, that's not the case across the board, but there are certain entities that will benefit from that. I'd also like to mention that the council has introduced some new SAQs, or one in particular that I'd like to call out. It's not directly a result of version 4, but it's important to know. If you are an entity that perhaps is a merchant or service provider using a commercial off-the-shelf device, for example, a phone or a tablet of some kind, and they have a secure card reader attached, and this is really common for certain merchants that I've even walking into retail sites, there's now an SAQ specifically for that called the SAQ SPOC or SPOC, which stands for Software Pin Entry on Commercial Off-the-Shelf Devices. And there's a new SAQ with bespoke requirements or specific requirements in order for them to comply.
Huge amount to unpack. You weren't lying when you said that the level of detail that these standards go into is incredible. And I think that's probably one of the big blockers or challenges for a lot of clients, organizations that process, transmit or store credit card payments. What would you say are the key things that those individuals, those organizations need to know?
I think the first thing would be how much a QSA can help. And I'm not just saying this as someone who likes to conduct PCI DSS engagements, I promise. Genuinely, when you read through the standard for your first time, and even my 20th, 50th time, there is still just a shocking amount of detail and information that you need to process. So I would say that's one of the first key elements that you need to know. Then moving on, I'd probably say you need to really understand that the way in which you did comply last year or prior to April 2024 is perfectly okay. However, the next assessment that you undergo, if you haven't already done so, needs to be to version 4. There are no more templates or processes available for you to attest or tell everyone that you are compliant to PCI DSS version 3.2.1. And anyone who does provide you with an attestation or a certificate to say, yes, I am, that's the first bit of detail to check. If it says 3.2.1 on it, that's no longer valid if they should have already gone through their annual validation. Moving on, the standard has changed, and it's highly unlikely that any entity will find out that their experience will be the exact same as it was. Even the entities that now have a reduced amount of obligations, and perhaps they have that one SAQ that has less questions on it, your experience will be different, even when you're completing the first section, which is justifying your payment channels and justifying the key elements of your organization. I think it's really important that you read through the correct assessment paperwork. In order to do this, you need to know you meet the eligibility criteria, and where possible, use a QSA to really define your scope, to understand exactly how you store, process, and transmit payment card data, or if you can impact the security of payment card data. I think that's really important. And the last point I like to leave on whenever I'm conducting any PCI DSS engagements is don't forget the future dated requirements. There's a nice buzz or feeling as and when you're ticking things as compliant, not compliant. And at the moment, for this interim period, when you come up to a future data requirement, you can just select not applicable if you don't answer it. As long as it says, it's a future data requirement and it needs to be in place by 31st of March 2025, and you don't have to worry about it. And it feels really nice to do so. However, when we get through to October, November, December, dare I say, January, February 2025, these are the assessments that are going to really have to have already forecasted out and said, we need that new solution in place. We need to already be conducting that new process. Because as soon as we hit 31st of March 2025, every single one of those requirements has to be compliant for you to be able to reach the sign off. And then lastly, I would just say again, to reiterate, a QSA can really help. They experience a great deal of engagement requests at the moment from entities that either want to learn about the changes, ensure their scope remains valid, and this is something we've seen a great deal of in Cyro Cyber. And then a key element, and I think one of the most useful services, is conducting readiness assessments, looking at where you are now and whether that's your first time compliant to PCI DSS or your 20th time compliant to PCI DSS, but then actually looking at what version 4 requires you to do and the level it requires you to be at, and then identifying the steps you need to get to or you need to complete in order to get to that requisite level.
Brilliant. I mean, I think, yeah, that's kind of where we were headed. I suppose it's that demystification. I think my next question was, how might a PCI expert or a QSA such as yourself help? But I think you've really answered that. I think it shows that it isn't just a blocker. It isn't bringing in an auditor that's going to sort of tell you off and give you black and white. It is about an individual that can guide you through the complexities of these changes and understand where there are those points for descope and for simplification. And that'll be a key thing with the changes to the SAQs as well. For this section, before I really do want to dedicate some time to some questions that we've had pre-populated. Finally, from myself, what are the key takeaways? What are those big ticket items that organizations should focus on now, if nothing else?
I would say be prepared is always the first point I think is important. Be prepared in terms of know what you're about to have to go through or you should be complying to, but also be prepared for some extended timelines. As an entity, it might be slightly difficult for you to align to the new standard or the new version, I should say. But then also as assessors, there's a bit of an experience now to try and say, well, things will take longer, and it's very difficult to explain to a customer or the person receiving the engagement that actually you require more days to complete this. And it's not to make more money, it's genuinely because there are more pages, there's more questions, more evidence that requires gathering. And certainly now there's more rules, and not directly relevant to version 4, but actually in September last year, the PCI Council communicated the statement that actually if you were a service provider, you cannot have a reduced scope anymore. You can't say that you only align to a certain SAQ and you should only answer those questions because you just provide an iframe, for example, or you just have payment devices in shops. Service providers don't benefit from that. Therefore, service providers need to go through an engagement that covers the entire standard, and that will require some testing from an assessor's point of view to identify which questions are relevant and write justification for why they wouldn't be. So I think just the biggest ticket item is be prepared and understand that there will be an embedded time frame here whereby an assessor and the entity needs to adjust to the new version.
That's brilliant. Peter, look, thank you so much for this. Some really fantastic insights there. And I think it really will help those that feel that they need to sort of keep up with the status of their own PCI compliance, but also these big ticket changes. Conscious of time, however, and that there may be some burning questions for those that have joined the chat today. If you have got a question, please do use that Q&A box. We're more than happy to answer anything now, and if we don't have time in the next 4 minutes, we will make sure we answer post this call. But some really quick fire ones, Peter, here, starting with some of the pre-submitted questions. How do I know if I need to comply and to what level? I guess that's a game where the QSA can help with sort of determining scope. Would you agree?
Yes, absolutely. I think that's a real key point there that you've made. So how do I know if I have to comply? By the letter of the rules, if you store, process, transmit payment card data, or you can impact the security of it, you should be complying. However, to help, the payment brands actually release merchant and service provider levels, and they then issue guidance on exactly how you should be complying. And helpfully, actually, I have a little rule of thumb. If you process more than 6 million transactions annually, you have to be assessed formally by a QSA, and that has to happen annually. You then attest with an AOC, an attestation of compliance, and you must be assessed against the entire standard. If you process less than 6 million annually, then actually you would fall into one of the merchant or service provider levels, and the requirements are slightly different. But as a general rule of thumb, that means you can and you are eligible to complete a self-assessment questionnaire. It would just be important to work with the QSA, if possible, to understand, well, which is the right self-assessment questionnaire that I should be filling in, and what other activities should I be doing throughout the year.
Throughout that period. Okay, that's brilliant. We have a couple of other pre-populated, but we've also got one from Andrew, so I want to get to that as well. So Andrew has posed, where is PCI DSS enforced? So what are the thresholds for self-assessment and external and so on and so forth? And does that change from 3.2.1 to 4? And are our clients particularly concerned about the associated fines? Is cyber insurance seen as a way of transferring the fine risk and not meeting the latest compliance? And what other repercussions outside of the fines are there? So I think the focus there being, has the threshold changed from 3.2.1 to 4? And thereafter, the concern around fines, what should clients think about there?
Absolutely, it's a great question from Andrew. So first of all, PCI DSS is not necessarily enforced. The council set the standard, so the PCI SSC set and maintain the standard itself, but the enforcement comes really direct from the payment brands and the acquiring banks. So your merchant acquiring bank or merchant bank would be who you report your compliance to. And so when that nice shiny form, the SAQ or the ROC, is completed, that's who the merchant or the service provider would hand that off to. The acquiring bank then has a responsibility to ensure that their entities or their customers are compliant. And really, the enforcement side comes from the payment brand or the acquiring bank can refuse to do business with you as an entity should you not comply. Or should you say that you're compliant, issue them a form or give them a form that you've signed yourself, and then actually for an event or security incident to take place, and in retrospect we discover that actually you've ticked the wrong box, or you've ticked the box not knowing that you've declared you are compliant and you shouldn't be, and so on and so forth. And that's where the responsibility lies. Other clients particularly concerned about fines? I'd say absolutely this is the main driving factor for almost all clients that I've worked with in every engagement. And as yet, actually, I've never seen cyber insurance to be seen as a way of transferring the risk. It's, in fact, there's no part of the PCI DSS, the standard, that says, do you hold cyber insurance? And that's a real key step. And I think a good conversation could be had there with cyber insurance providers to identify exactly how and in what way they're working with their customers and people seeking insurance, and then understanding their compliance to a greater degree.
That's it. And we've seen some insights on that as well, Peter, in terms of where cyber insurance is underwritten. It's usually pinned against the standard. So it says if you haven't met the standard, then we can't underwrite you against a risk against that standard. So the fine would still stand because the insurance would just say you need to adhere to best practice, which is always the key dilemma.
Yes.
I will have to pause you there. I think we are at time, and I know that others will need to get off. This is such a meaty subject. I think it's absolutely worth revisiting, and I think that's something that we will do as an organisation in another of our educational webinars. I just wanted to reiterate the thanks that was shared earlier. Thank you, everybody, for joining. I think it's been a really engaging conversation. So, Peter, thanks for your time. We will start to share some further detail on some of the other questions that were posed around customized approach versus compensating controls, and around how that PCI assessment really works. But for now, if there's any burning questions, any questions from anybody that attended that you feel you need to gain answers to, and you want that done in a more private setting, my email address and Peter's email address is on this slide now. We'll also share that afterwards with all, and please do come to us with any questions. We as Cyro believe we want to be helpful, and that's really what we want to convey with this session. So it is just us providing that advice and guidance, and we're more than happy to do that. But as promised, we'll share these links from a recording perspective, and we will keep you up to date with further details of webinars and content over the coming months. But for now, just everyone, thank you very much for your time. Really, really appreciate it. And we'll see you in the next session. Thanks all.